But what it was at the beginning was human cockfighting. It was. I mean, I've seen people repeatedly getting smashed in the face with a guy sitting on top of them. That's not a sport. That's a throwback to the Roman Colosseum.
Mixed martial arts in the 90s was nowhere near as publicized as it is today. The big stage, fighters having a set career path, and fighting promotions getting huge TV and brand deals could not be seen back then. The 90s were mainly a time of strife and global backlash for the MMA community. While there were golden era fans who loved the sport from its inception, it was being systematically fought by both the general public and officials in power who had a say in the public domain. Let's just say that even if the UFC was gaining publicity, this wasn't the good kind. And I'm not here to say that all of these concerns were necessarily incorrect. Many critics had pretty decent reasons for why they weren't fans at the time. The first major issue was the lack of sanctioning in the sport. This is ironic because sanctioning in the UFC is now one of the most important parts of the sport, but back then, they really couldn't care less. The competitions were completely unregulated by any commission, whether local or regional, and this left the door open to so much. Fighters would not be drug tested, which meant they could come into a fight juiced to the max on PEDs or performance-enhancing drugs, and there would be neither any test nor any punishment. Absence of this knowledge would also mean that there were no medical suspensions based on a given fighter's diuretic levels, and that cheats could continue climbing the contender ladder unbothered. Increasing the danger for fighters, there was also the famous no-holds-barred competition style, which dominated back then. This simply meant that almost everything was fair play, although a few of the moves have been ruled illegal from the early days, like no biting, eye gouging, or fish hooking. Other brutal shots, like being kicked to the head on the ground, were allowed. Early fight broadcasts even showed many other ultra-violent tactics, including hair pulling, headbutts, and groin striking, which of course shocked the viewers. Additionally, there were no time limits in the initial tournament style of the competition, which meant no rounds, and a lack of weight classes, which meant smaller grapplers could fight much larger strikers. As you can imagine, this did nothing to help the image. This was the lives and the livelihood of fighters being put on the line every time they accepted another fight, and the general public saw more of a danger aspect than an entertaining one. There were many overly brutal in-cage assaults and events which sparked outrage from even day one fans. Some stood out more than others. For example, the Yuki Nakai blinding in 1995. At Valetudo, Japan in 1995, Dutch fighter Gerard Gordeau intentionally and repeatedly gouged the eye of Japanese fighter Yuki Nakai. Nakai hid the injury to keep the tournament going, but was left permanently blind in his right eye. Keith Hackney vs. Joe Son. Before groin strikes were banned, Keith Hackney utilized the lack of rules in the most brutal way possible against Joe Son. After the fight hit the canvas, Hackney positioned himself over Son and landed a series of uninterrupted, direct fist strikes straight to Son's groin. Amazingly, Son did not immediately pass out. He survived the strikes only to submit to a choke moments later. Mark Kerr's addiction. As captured in the documentary The Smashing Machine, heavyweight powerhouse Mark Kerr dominated in late 90s tournaments while secretly battling a severe, life-threatening addiction to anabolic steroids and painkillers, exposing the dark underbelly of fighter health at the time. Then of course there was the huge debacle over fixed fights. As the sport transitioned out of the 1990s, rumblings of fight fixing began to surface, particularly out of Japan's unregulated Pride Fighting Championships and Pancrase organizations. Rumors heavily circulated that certain veteran American wrestlers and fighters were paid to take dives or orchestrate warped submission finishes to build up localized Japanese superstars. Then there was the famous John McCain versus the UFC period. John McCain was a prominent US senator from Arizona, known for his gift of negotiation. He made headlines most notably for working to normalize diplomatic relations with Vietnam and his finance reform campaign in Washington. In 1996, John McCain publicly called out and launched a determined crusade against the UFC. He was calling for the sport at that time to be banned throughout the country, infamously labeling it as human cockfighting. This did nothing to help the view of the UFC at this time, as you can imagine, but this is exactly what Senator McCain wanted. He didn't just stop there. In that same year, he sent personalized letters to all governors in all 50 US states, urging them to ban the sport outright. In the history of the UFC, Although there had been sports personnel and others who would comment on the state of the UFC at that point, there had never been anyone with this much political power fighting so relentlessly against the sport. He described it as a barbaric, no-holds-barred spectacle. He saw no value in it. John McCain's constant pressure succeeded in getting the sport outlawed in 36 states, well over half, and pressure major cable operators to drop pay-per-view broadcasts. Not only was the UFC being blackballed nationally, their media deals were also in jeopardy. This campaign, pushed by one man's personal feelings towards an entire sport, almost ended the sport before it even got a chance to be on its feet. The Nevada State Athletic Commission also refused to sanction UFC bouts, effectively banning it from major casino markets. Dana White and the UFC brass quickly realized that if they didn't make a change, the UFC would be dead in the water. These executives had already been working so hard and seen the true potential of the UFC, so regardless of how relentless the external pressure was, they refused to give up. They decided that it was time to make changes, important ones at that, changes that would allow the UFC to keep growing and thriving. They had a lot of work to do at this point. Many people who had barely heard of the sport only heard negative things, but they were in the business of changing minds and hearts. While the exact list of the 36 states which banned the sport isn't explicitly available, some of the more prominent ones were New York, California, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. The UFC knew these states held major shares in their profit markets, and so they started there, fixing the sanctions and regulations. The UFC shifted away from the no-holds-barred tournament style to introducing weight classes, rounds, and mandatory safety equipment. With just these few changes, the UFC had already begun looking like a regulated sport. They then improved more by paying attention to the medical side of the sport, ensuring that fighters were as healthy as possible before, during, and after a fight, including drug testing and medical suspensions. With this subsequent reinvention of the UFC, the sport was no longer under threat of dying or outright abolishment. These changes allowed the public to see that MMA and the UFC was a sport of skill, talent, and sportsmanship just like all other sports. The shift from the early days of fighting to an era where fighters' health and well-being was being prioritized was the exact shift the UFC needed to be accepted by the public. Sponsors and television networks slowly started to accept the new reality of the UFC and subsequently invested as well. And just like that, before we knew it, the UFC went from being on the brink of extinction to a multi-million-dollar investment for those involved. By 2000, states like New Jersey began implementing regulations, creating a framework which eventually swept the nation. Although New York held out the longest, after infamously banning the sport on the eve of UFC 12 in Buffalo 1997, they finally legalized MMA and the UFC in 2016. By the 2010s, the UFC was involved in groundbreaking television broadcasting deals, a landmark exclusive apparel partnership, and a historic $4 billion corporate buyout. In 2011, the UFC signed a 7-year, roughly $100 million per year broadcasting deal with Fox, moving the sport off cable networks like Spike TV and onto network television. This gave the UFC unprecedented mainstream exposure and stable revenue. This lasted until 2018. In 2018, the UFC transitioned to ESPN, signing a massive 5-year, $1.5 billion rights deal. This moved preliminary matches, main cards, and the ESPN Plus streaming platform to the forefront of American sports broadcasting. With the Reebok deal in 2015, the UFC signed a 6-year, $70 million exclusive uniform deal with Reebok, which completely changed the financial landscape for fighters. And just last year, August 2025, the UFC signed their most historic, most lucrative deal with Paramount, a 7-year, $7.7 billion deal, which shifts all fight nights and numbered events over to Paramount Plus. From being considered as human cockfighting to one of the most lucrative deals in sports history, the UFC has come a long way. One thing that never changed about it was Dana White's vision for the sport. He took all the criticism and harsh backlash, and instead of giving up, he asked himself what could he actually do about it. By 2014, even John McCain himself, Yes, the very man who lobbied for the sport to be banned all over the country, he saw the changes and completely reversed his stance.
They've cleaned up their act enormously. Actually, this ultimate fighting now isn't a heck of a lot different from boxing. So they have changed dramatically.
He was seen alongside UFC executives supporting and funding brain injury research at the Cleveland Clinic, and even later admitting in interviews that if the UFC was what it is today, he would have tried his hand in it back when he was a young man in the Navy. The tumultuous history of the UFC and MMA is the reason why it stands firmly and why the sport has so many fans worldwide.
And what's amazing about the UFC and the first UFC is that since 1993, martial arts has evolved more than it has in the last 10,000 years. And it's continuing to evolve because of the UFC. So while, the gentleman who owned this before we did, if he had not done that and done it the way that he did it, we wouldn't be here today, and this new martial art wouldn't have been invented.
All right, guys, now that was just my little reminder that at one point it really was the UFC versus the world. And these days we see it on the biggest stages and on streaming platforms, but it really almost didn't get on its feet. But all us fight fans are grateful that it did. Thank you guys for watching. If you guys like the video, please like the video, and I will be posting weekly, so please subscribe. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.